designing the environment and things like that, I just want to take you through a few things in the scene that I like to turn off or adjust. Right now you sort of see this large cube here with these other icons, and that's showing you the actual texture locators and how they're projected in the scene. But to be honest, I find them kind of a little bit annoying when I'm looking down here in the UI. So again, if you want to turn those off for this viewport, have your mouse hovered over this bottom perspective viewport, hit O on the keyboard for view options, O for options, and let's just turn off texture locators. This is also where we can turn off our grid or our work plane. Personally, since we already kind of got our modeling done, I don't really need to see our work plane too much. And since I know where my ground plane is, I don't even really necessarily care to see my grid. I like to kind of look when I'm rendering or in my render tab, just kind of keep it clean with just the 3D geometry. When you're modeling, I definitely always keep my work plane on, things like that. But here, I like a nice kind of clean UI. Obviously, this is your own sort of preference, but for me, I like to kind of keep it clean. And one other thing we're going to notice is the camera's pretty darn large. The center of the lens is actually coming from right here, not way up here, else we obviously wouldn't be seen through the camera. So one thing I do is, depending on my scene scale, since this is pretty real world in a smaller scene, is I like to change the display on the camera and turn them down. So by having the camera selected, come over to the display tab here and make its size. Let's just try 0.25, and maybe even just 0.1. That's a little small. Let's just do 0.2. Anyways, it's not actually changing the scale of the camera or changing any of the focal length or anything like that. It's just simply a display thing, how we actually see it here in the UI. And for me, this looks a little bit closer to the actual scale I would think if it's shooting the cup. Again, didn't change anything. These are simply sort of just display options. So now that we have that ready and we have our materials, generally set, we're going to change all these as we go along. Let's take a look at the environment tab and see what's actually lighting our scene. If we look in here, we have this environment material. And right now it's just set to a 4-color gradient. You can kind of see that happening. There's white up top and a darker value towards the bottom. But what we want to do is start adding some sort of image into there. And this is another great time of start using those render presets. So if we come into our render preset browser, double-click environments. We have all sorts of ones, indoor, outdoor, and studio ones that come inside of Modo. And since this is pretty much an indoor shot, let's just start double-clicking these and seeing what we get. So, I don't know. Again, this can be completely up to you. But what we're trying to get are some reflections and refractions that are looking pretty cool throughout the glass. Let's jump back into that final render. And that's what we're seeing. See these little highlights we see up here, things like that. Those are all coming from the environment. Now here, there's an image map that we're going to project soon, coming right behind the object itself. So we're seeing that refracted through the glass. But really we want to kind of get whatever these highlights are and things like that. So that's all coming from what's wrapped around the scene. This kitchen one's all right, but it's a little bit too well defined. I often use this subway probe here. It's still a little defined, but we are going to put an image behind that. But overall, it's a little bright. Right now, it's overly bright in the scene because we also have the directional light on. So not only are we lighting with global illumination from the environment, but this light is actually affecting our attributes as well. So if I turn it off, you'll see it gets a little bit darker, but we're still pretty darn bright because of this. I'm actually going to right-click and delete that light. CG lights can add sort of harsh spec highlights and things like that. And I like to really kind of start with an environment, and we'll start building up our lights as we go along. Still not quite in love with the environment itself. Let's go to this foyer probe. And I kind of like the warmthness that we're getting here. But it's not quite giving me the highlights where I want them. But one thing we can do is we come down to the environment node here in the shader tree, click the image itself. Now we go to that texture locator. Again, the texture locator is how these images are projected in the scene. And what we can do is rotate it around in Y. So if I start pulling the slider to the left, you'll see that image is going to start moving around the image, around the scene. Now we're already kind of, oh, that's something kind of cool. Some highlights coming through here. Can continue to refine that. Some fun stuff. And I just kind of pull these sliders and just start seeing what's reflected. And this nice bright highlight, that's actually pretty cool. That might be useful. I'll do this all day long. I'll just start spinning environments, scaling environments, moving them, swapping out different HDRs. And for the most part, right now, this is looking, it's something. And these highlights are a little strong. I don't think I like those. Anyways, I'm not going to get too picky right now. Let's put this back to maybe 50 around, because right now what next I want to do is add an image map behind this to see what the reflections or refractions through the glass are actually going to be. One way we can do it is just dropping that in the environment itself. So I come to add layer, I do a load image, or come down to image map, load image, while we're still in the environment node down here on the bottom. Now we're going to add our own image. We're not going to override the image probe, we're just going to load a new one here. And let's just go to our scene. That's our whiskey render, image maps, background 01. And this image I'll provide for you guys. And let's just drop that in the scene. So right now that's being spherically wrapped. But really we just want to see what that image is directly projected through the camera itself. So right now if we look at the texture locator, again that's being completely spherically wrapped as if we're on the inside of a sphere. But right now I just want to project that as a front projection and through the camera. So pick the projection camera and choose our camera itself. And now we're looking at exactly what this image is here, being projected one-to-one through our camera. So one thing we have to worry about in Modo is something called gamma and gamma correction. If we look at our final color output, you're noticing we're rendering at an output gamma of 2.2. That's screen space. Linear space is 1, but we're not going to get too far into that in this tutorial. I'm just going to show you how to kind of control these values. So if I load the image itself, you can see it's got a lot of dark values, but we're seeing it here and it's way too bright and sort of blown out. So what that means is we got to take what our final color output is of 2.2 and invert that into our image itself. Sounds confusing, I know, but this is, you don't actually have to know the technical aspects of this. All you really have to know is how to change it. So right now our gamma is 1. So the way to change that is to do a little math. We want to divide 1 by what the final color output is, 2.2. So if you simply enter, you can do actually math in these text fields. So we add a backslash, 2.2. So we're actually doing 1 divided by 2.2, enter. And now we just kind of invert gamma corrected what that image is going to be. And now you can see that's matching a whole lot better to this, or it's matching exactly the values of what the input of the image is. So no longer is it washed out. We're getting all those nice rich blacks and dark tones in there. I'm suspecting the table itself, that image looks a little washed out to me too. So I'm going to click on that guy. Again, if you click on it in preview, it's going to load its material in the material list. And yeah, it's using an improper gamma. It's using a gamma of 0.8. So basically any color maps that you bring in, you're going to want to do this invert gamma process. So I know it's going to sound a little confusing now, but all we have to do is 1 divided by 2.2 on the gamma of every image. And now we're going to get all the real richness that is coming in from that image. No longer is it washed out. And now you can see our scene's already looking a lot better. We're getting a lot richer values throughout. I'm going to start playing with my camera just a little bit and get a little bit lower here on the lens. I was noticing some of the tables being refracted too much through the camera. I mean, this is all going to be to taste. We're going to be rendering, changing our camera throughout the scene, but for the most part, this is looking, pretty good. So it's kind of a little confusing, but right now we have two images for the environment. You see we have this first probe that'll be loaded from the preset, but we've also added this other one on top. Problem is the one we added on top is only being front projected, so we actually still are seeing these kind of square highlights are actually coming from the probe itself. Because all we're seeing is this one, the image we added ourselves. It's just basically sitting behind there. It's not actually wrapped around the scene. What's wrapped around the scene is still this image probe. So if we start spinning that guy, you're going to notice those highlights will shift and kind of come around. So you got to kind of imagine there's a card sitting behind the camera or behind the scene, and that's what this image is here. But we also have the other one completely wrapped around our scene. But for the most part, we're starting to get kind of a nice environment built. Now, one thing I'm noticing that I'm not quite loving is this big sort of hard refracted part here. And that's actually coming from the table itself. At least that's my guess. So I'm going to come to the table, select it in item mode, or just come here to the item list and grab it. Let's go remove tool. And I think it's just too far back here. If we look through our camera, we're just sort of seeing some of this back end of the table. I'm not quite loving it. So I'm just going to start kind of playing. Look at that. As soon as I pulled it closer to the frame, now we're no longer seeing that refracted through the glass. Glasses and liquids, it's a tricky little thing to refine because it's so much of it is dependent on the environment itself. Even the camera angle. If I raise my camera up here and we move around, you'll notice, the scene is completely different. The refractions are completely different. So there's so much refining and tweaking on these sort of things. I'm not sure I love this highlight here, so I might need to shift my environment around. All that will come kind of in the final stages. But for the most part, I think the scene's looking pretty good. I think the liquid might be a little too rich. That looks like a little bit lighter color in a lot of these references. So let's go take a look at the material attributes for that. So we go to the liquid tab. Let's go to this beer amber. And here's the transparent color itself. Let's take that and let's maybe make that a little bit more of an amber color. We go all the way up to yellow. You're still seeing, well, it's still pretty dark and rich. And I think some of that's having to do with the absorption distance. So the absorption distance is kind of mimicking a real-world liquid. So we're seeing at 100 millimeters, it's picking up this dark color. If I change this absorption distance to 0, it's going to be pretty much all that dark sort of amber color, but you would expect to see a little bit of fall off towards the edges. So if I make this absorption distance a little bit higher, we should start getting a little bit clearer liquid, essentially. Still not loving it. I'm going to drop that back down to maybe about 50 millimeters actually, because it's about half of the width of the glass is what we want. Now let's continue to kind of pick some of a lighter color in here. It's not too bad. Again, I think a lot of that is actually dependent on what we're refracting through, and that's actually picking up a lot of this brown hues of the table. So for now, we're going to leave that alone. But just continuing to refine the scene. I'm no longer, well, I mean, I do like this wood material, but I think we could kind of add a little bit something to it. So let me show you how to bring in your own image maps. Starting with presets is a great way, but bringing in your own image maps can really help give you the exact look you're looking for. So one great resource I use all the time, CG Textures. I believe it's just going to create a free account and you can download. I think there's a paid one. You got some higher res versions, but honestly, you can type in any search engine, type in wood texture, things like that, and you're going to find all sorts of materials. But I'm going to jump into the wood section here. Fine wood's more or less what we're looking for, and let's take a look. do like the warmth of this guy here. So let's take a look at this texture here, and I'm gonna download this one. It's gonna pop open here, but let me just jump back. I'm gonna take that material and I'm gonna drop it into our images directory in our project that we created earlier. Now that we have that, let's jump into Modo and let's replace this texture with that. Again, this one looks really nice, but I'm just gonna see what it looks like with the other one. So let's come in here, grab our image map, and in our clip browser, you can see everything that we've loaded so far. Let's just do load image. And since we already had our project directory set, it's going to jump right into that proper directory. Would find 3. I think that just gave it a little bit of a nicer, softer feel overall. The bump map is still using the one from our last other image, so I'm going to come in there and change that from the preset one to the same. And let's just make sure those are projected. They're both being wrapped 3 times. It's only being wrapped once, so just make sure you have the same proper wrapping for your bump map and your diffuse color. That way that image lines up properly. But one thing I'm noticing is just kind of too bright overall. So what we can do is we can instance this diffuse color. So I'm going to come down here, choose create instance. And right now I want to override the diffuse amount. Right now the diffuse amount's 80%, and that's pretty high to be honest with you. Well, not necessarily high, but I want this sort of darker feel to my whole scene, at least to the wood itself. So on the diffuse color, I'm going to come down to the right click on the effect and change it from diffuse color down to diffuse amount. And that's already starting to look kind of cool. Right now it's going from a low value, so it's basically saying the darkest values in that image are giving me no diffuse, and the highest are 100. So we can drop this maybe even down to 50. And we don't ever really want to be 0 diffuse, so that's just basically returning black values. So let's give it maybe a 10. It's a little bright. 10 to 25. Maybe that 0 was looking pretty good. Let's go back to the image we're trying to kind of replicate. And it is pretty dark overall. I'm going to add some spotlights here in the next chapter to kind of bring up some of these other values. So right now I'm kind of liking it. But I almost want the wood grain to be going the opposite direction. Right now it's all going right, which isn't horrible, but that's an easy fix. So again, we are projecting that wood based on the UV map. So if I click it itself, let's jump over to the UV tab, and I want to select this polygon itself. Actually, we can select all of them since there is no UV for the outer one. If we go to our lists, our UV maps, it's using that texture map right here. So if I deselect that, you can kind of see how the wood grain is being projected just flat on. But in the UV tab, if I select this, I rotate, and I rotate over here on the UV 90 degrees or negative 90, you can see we just basically turned how that wood is being projected. I kind of like that. It's creating a nice line, bringing our eye out here, and our wood's now coming directly in. Overall, it's feeling pretty good. Still think maybe it's a little bit too bright, a little too shiny. But for right now, I think I'm going to leave that alone, and let's jump into the next chapter of actually placing some lights and refining our scene just a little bit more.